Homeless at 18, the bank wanted to take my only inheritance. Then something happened. My name is Susan Aaron, and when I was 18 years old, I learned how quickly a person can lose everything they thought would always be there. One week, I still had a place to call home. The next, I was sleeping in the front seat of a rusted blue pickup truck that barely ran, wondering how long I could stretch a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter before I had nothing left to eat. Looking back now, I can still remember the feeling of that first night. The truck was parked beside an abandoned grain elevator on the edge of town. The wind pushed against the metal doors and made sounds that felt almost human in the darkness. Every shadow seemed larger than it really was. Every noise made me jump. I was 18 years old, completely alone, and terrified of what the next morning would bring. Not money, not a house, not a college fund, not family willing to help. Just a piece of farmland my grandfather had left behind before he died. It wasn't a large farm by Missouri standards. Just over 100 acres of rolling fields surrounded by old oak trees, a weathered red barn leaning slightly to one side, and a farmhouse that had not seen fresh paint in nearly 20 years. To most people, it looked tired and forgotten. To me, it was everything. Every childhood memory I treasured lived on that land. I learned how to ride a horse there. I learned how to fish in the pond behind the barn. I learned how to drive an old tractor sitting on my grandfather's lap while he laughed every time I nearly stalled the engine. When he passed away, the farm became mine. At least that was what I believed. What nobody told me was that inheritance and ownership are not always the same thing. 3 months after the funeral, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. I still remember sitting in the truck when I opened it. The paper inside smelled fresh, like it had just come off a printer. Legal words filled every page. Most of them meant nothing to me, but one sentence stood out clearly enough to make my hands start shaking. The bank intended to begin foreclosure proceedings. I read the sentence 3 times, then a 4th, then a 5th, each time hoping the words would somehow change. They didn't. My grandfather had borrowed against portions of the property years earlier during a drought. He had always intended to repay the debt, but illness came first, then medical bills, then more loans. By the time he died, the debt hanging over the farm was far larger than anyone had realized. And if they didn't get it, they wanted the land, the last thing I had left. I remember driving to the farm that afternoon with tears running down my face, so hard I could barely see the road. The sky was gray, and a cold rain had started falling across the fields. Everything looked darker than usual. The barn stood silently against the horizon. The old farmhouse windows reflected the storm clouds above. Even the cattle in the neighboring pasture seemed to move more slowly beneath the rain. Sometimes people think crying makes a person weak. They're wrong. There are moments in life when your heart becomes so heavy that tears are the only thing keeping it from breaking completely apart. That afternoon was one of those moments. I wasn't crying because of the money. I wasn't crying because of the debt. I was crying because I felt like I was losing my grandfather all over again. Every fence post on that property reminded me of him. Every tree, every gate, every path through the fields. If the bank took the farm, it wouldn't just be land disappearing. It would be my history, my family, my memories, my home. The bank didn't care that I was 18. They didn't care that I was sleeping in a truck. They didn't care that I was scared. To them, numbers were numbers. Deadlines were deadlines. Debt was debt. The letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. Every envelope felt heavier than the one before. People in town started hearing rumors. Some said the farm would be auctioned within months. Others said developers were already interested in buying it. One man even offered me a fraction of its value because he assumed I was desperate enough to accept anything. Maybe I was desperate, but I wasn't ready to surrender.
Not yet.
Because every time I thought about giving up, I heard my grandfather's voice. He used to tell me something whenever storms damaged crops. He'd stand in the middle of a field, wipe dirt from his hands, and say, "Land has a way of rewarding people who refuse to walk away from it." At 18 years old, sitting alone inside a pickup truck, I held on to those words like they were the last rope keeping me from falling. What I didn't know then was that my grandfather had left behind more than a farm. He had left behind a secret hidden so well that even the bank didn't know it existed, a secret buried somewhere on that property. And within a few weeks, that secret would change everything. The bank thought they were preparing to take my inheritance. What they didn't realize was that the land they considered ordinary was about to become the most valuable property in the entire county. If you're enjoying my story, subscribe and share the video, because what happened next still feels unbelievable even all these years later. And it began with an old wooden box I found beneath the floorboards of my grandfather's barn. The morning I found that wooden box, I wasn't searching for treasure. I wasn't hunting for hidden money or secret documents. The truth is, I was simply trying to keep my mind busy. When you're 18 years old, sleeping in a pickup truck, and waiting for a bank to take the last thing your family ever left you, you learn very quickly that staying busy is sometimes the only thing keeping fear from swallowing you whole. That morning, the sun had barely risen above the hills surrounding the farm. A thin blanket of fog drifted across the pasture, and the old barn stood quietly at the edge of the property, its weathered red boards glowing softly in the early light. I remember walking toward it with a broom in one hand and a toolbox in the other, telling myself that if the farm was going to be taken away, at least I would spend my remaining days there caring for it. The barn smelled exactly as it always had.
Dust.
Old wood. Machinery that hadn't run in years. Every corner held memories of my grandfather. The workbench where he repaired tools. The hooks where he hung ropes. The old lantern he carried during winter storms. I found myself smiling through tears as I cleaned. It felt like spending one more day with him. One more conversation. One more chance to hear his voice. Hours passed before I noticed something unusual. Near the back wall, beneath an old cabinet, several floorboards appeared newer than the rest. Not new exactly, but different. Less worn, less faded. At first, I ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. Using a crowbar, I carefully lifted one of the boards. And there it was, a small wooden box covered in dust. My heart immediately started racing. Not because I expected riches, but because I knew my grandfather well enough to understand that he never did anything without a reason. It was a letter, written by my grandfather, addressed to me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold it. The letter explained that many years earlier, before I was even born, a geological survey team had visited portions of the county. While studying underground formations, they discovered something unusual beneath a section of our property. The survey suggested the presence of a rare mineral deposit. At the time, no mining companies showed serious interest because extraction technology wasn't advanced enough to make development profitable. But my grandfather never forgot. He kept every report, every map, every note. And for decades, he quietly believed that one day the land would be worth far more than anyone imagined. As I continued reading, tears streamed down my face, not because of the possibility of money, but because I realized what he had done. He knew his health was failing. He knew debt was piling up. And somehow, despite everything, he spent years preserving information he hoped would someday protect me. Even after he was gone, even after he could no longer speak. He was still trying to take care of me. I cried harder than I had at his funeral, because in that moment I understood something beautiful. Love doesn't always end when a person dies. Sometimes it continues through the things they leave behind. The following weeks were a blur. I contacted geological consultants, then attorneys, then property specialists. At first, nobody took me seriously. I was an 18-year-old homeless girl carrying old maps and handwritten notes. Most people assumed I was desperate. Some smiled politely. Others barely listened. But eventually one consultant agreed to review the documents. 3 weeks later, he called me. I still remember sitting in my truck when the phone rang. His voice sounded completely different than before. Excited.
Urgent.
Almost shocked. The original survey had been correct. Beneath portions of the farm existed a substantial mineral deposit, large enough to attract commercial interest, large enough to completely transform the property's value. News spread faster than wildfire. The same people who once whispered about the farm being worthless suddenly couldn't stop talking about it. Lawyers started calling. Investors started appearing. Companies requested meetings. Land experts who had never shown interest before were suddenly driving down our gravel road every week. Then something happened that nobody expected. The bank changed its tone. Immediately, the threatening letters stopped. The pressure stopped. The urgency disappeared. Suddenly, they wanted conversations instead of demands. Negotiations instead of deadlines. Funny how quickly people change when they realize what they're about to lose. The farm was mine. Completely mine. The first thing I did wasn't buy a new car. It wasn't buy expensive clothes. It wasn't move into a mansion. I repaired the farmhouse. Then the barn. Then the fences. I restored the place my grandfather loved. Every board I replaced felt like a thank you letter. Every repair felt like honoring a promise. Years passed. The farm prospered. The investments grew. The property became one of the most valuable pieces of land in the county. But the greatest gift wasn't the money. The greatest gift was security. For the first time since my grandfather died, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't sleeping in a truck. I wasn't opening foreclosure notices. I wasn't wondering where I would live next month. I finally had a future. And sometimes, late in the evening, I'll sit on the porch and watch the sunset settle over the fields. The same fields the bank once wanted to take. The same fields everyone assumed I would lose. The same fields where an 18-year-old girl once stood crying in the rain, convinced her world was ending. When I think back to that frightened young girl, I wish I could sit beside her for just a moment and tell her something. I'd tell her that not every ending is an ending. I'd tell her that sometimes the darkest chapter happens right before the most beautiful one begins. I'd tell her that the people who truly love us often leave behind gifts that are far greater than money. And I'd tell her to keep going, because the story isn't over yet. It almost never is. If you've listened to my story this far, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who may be going through a difficult season. Life has a way of convincing us that everything is lost when we can only see part of the picture. But sometimes the answer is already there, waiting beneath the surface, hidden where nobody thinks to look. The bank thought they were taking my inheritance. Instead, they unknowingly pushed me toward discovering it. And every time I walk across that farm today, I remember one simple truth my grandfather taught me long ago. Land remembers. Love remains. And hope has a strange way of showing up when you need it most.